University of California at Berkeley, Research Day 2018. Title, Accessibility and the Common Core. Presented by Yue-Ting Su, TVI Comms, PhD, Program in Visual Impairments, San Francisco State University, Twitter at TVI_Ting.
Okay, so thank you, David, for setting the tone for this talk. As a teacher of the visually impaired, talking about the Common Core is an interesting place to be right now because as a teacher who has specifically worked with students with visual impairments and their access to Common Core, I feel like it's always been in the nature of my work as an educator to actually be disruptive and almost like a rebel educator because as a teacher of the visually impaired, or TVI, we're always having to find workarounds around the Common Core and everything that is sort of imposed on our students because our students can't even access enough of the Common Core content to build any momentum at all that David was referring to. So for me, it becomes an issue of equity when students don't even have the opportunity to fail at building this momentum towards their learning. So in David's article, and I'm basically just shamelessly riffing off of David's work in this area. So I love this one quote from his article, which is, "The Common Core state standards leave a little room for players at every level in the educational system to place their signature on the standards." So this presentation now is to place my accessibility signature on the standards. You know, everybody comes to accessibility from a different perspective, a different lens. So this particular presentation is my unique accessibility signature. All of you might have your own and develop your own as you go through your research and practices in your profession. I did want to thank Renee Starowitz just for her invitation to present here and also for her amazing work in promoting diversity and accessibility in the GSE. I also wanted to thank Francis Ramos for fielding the logistics of everything, and I'm really sorry for all of my last-minute emails. So basically, preparing for this talk has really challenged me to rethink how I think about accessibility, and it's given me a different sort of grounding to how I talk about access to instruction and differentiating instruction for students not just with visual impairments, but for all disabilities or diversities, we call them now, including sensory diversities, which include visual impairments, deaf and hard of hearing, deaf blindness, and neurodiversities, including print disabilities, dyslexia, and autism. So I always love a pop quiz. Anybody know what hashtag A11Y is? Any social media birds in the audience? Okay, well, I'm going to give you a hint. Hashtag A11Y stands for a word that was on my title slide, if you guys were paying attention. Accessibility, yes. So, there's a lot of information and resources about accessibility. On social media, you can just look for hashtag A11Y, and you'll come up with a lot of information there to start connecting with stakeholders in the various areas of accessibility to start building that community of practice around accessibility. I know David, the time just runs away. So in David's article, he really talked about 5 major assumptions of the Common Core standards. I wanted to just skim the surface of each of these assumptions with my accessibility lens. So number 1, you know, the learning progressions that David mentioned. Well, you know, these students are learning, it's assumed that students learn along a normed sequence of instruction. This is a really big issue for our students who have diverse learning needs because first, students must overcome accessibility challenges in every task. So they never ever get that luxury of redundancy in their learning process that David mentioned. And if students don't ever get to develop this redundancy in their learning, how can they even develop the solid foundations to progress from? On the slide here, a major accessibility consideration, A11Y consideration, is that how do sensory or neurological diversities embellish normed learning progressions? So not only disrupt, but I say embellish because I really believe that when we can differentiate learning to meet these diverse learners, you actually end up improving the learning of all students in the classroom. So on the right side of the slide, this is the English Braille alphabet, just to show the differences in how even the basic building blocks of literacy, for students who are using Braille as their medium, their literacy medium, they actually need to learn how to read Braille in a different progression from you would teach print alphabet. You would never want to teach two Braille, two letters together where the Braille is too similar. You actually want to choose which letters you teach depending on how similar or different they are textually. Another example is Hacker Calculus. This is Joan Horvath's work. She's actually coming to speak here in April for the GSE Colloquium, so Lloyd's got the information online. So Joan is kind of disrupting how calculus is taught in the Common Core now and taking us back to when calculus was first conceptualized without computers, without 3D printing, without coding. How was it taught back then and conceptualized? Okay, moving on to the second assumption, which is literacy is best developed and enacted in the service of acquiring disciplinary expertise. So this means that students build their literacy while accessing content, while you learn to read when you're accessing literary texts. You are developing numeracy when you're accessing mathematical content. You are developing data literacy in those STEM classes. But what if those tools and media of each discipline are not accessible to the students? So for example, in the bottom left corner of the slide, we have just a map, a world map of world migration patterns. And you can imagine this map being presented in like a history or geography kind of class. This is often inaccessible to students with any sort of dysgraphia, dyslexia, print disability, students who are low vision or blind or vision impaired. How do we ensure students have the same access to this content so that they can develop, they can acquire this disciplinary expertise? The top right of the slide is just a screenshot of a new developing app called CodeQuest. This is, to my knowledge, the only truly robust, accessible coding platform that is suitable for students with low vision or who are totally non-visual or blind learners. Other applications such as Scratch Junior are not accessible. So when a school adopts Scratch Junior, what happens to those kids who can't access that tool for learning? And in the bottom right, I always hate to identify what doesn't work without providing something that does work. It's just a screenshot of OpenSCAD, which is the only potentially accessible interface for coding for our students. Other interfaces are highly visual and graphical and not accessible. So those students who are in those situations where they can't access the coding programs, they are not developing any sort of literacy in that discipline. Okay, we're just skating right along to assumption number 3, which is standards establish ends or goals, and that teachers and schools still control the means. I love this part of the standards because it still recognizes that teachers have some sort of pedagogical expertise in how to teach. So, this is a great part of the standards. It's very encouraging that that teachers are still given the agency to develop their own teacher-created materials. It's really encouraged that it's more of this bottom-up than top-down approach, where teachers get to create the learning media and lessons. However, accessibility-wise, this means that there really needs to be more embedded research to inform practice that can model interdisciplinary collaboration between general and special education. Because every time a general education teacher develops their own materials or finesses the curricula in some point, they could potentially be breaking that accessibility for students with diverse learning needs unless this gen ed teacher has been closely collaborating with a special educator who can inform about how do we need to differentiate for a non-visual learner. How do we need to differentiate this for a student who has got some sort of dyslexia? Okay? So, this also kind of implies that there needs to be interdisciplinary collaboration beginning in the teacher prep programs and beginning in all of our research base, even when we're learning how to conduct research in education. Another great opportunity here is to integrate accessibility practices with UDL, or Universal Design for Learning. So how many here have heard of UDL? Yes, right? However, how many of you guys are familiar with the Web AIM standards of accessibility? That might be a smaller niche, but if you look at those Web AIM accessibility standards, there's great opportunities to really overlay that with what a lot of educators already know about UDL. So this is just an avenue, lots of opportunities for communication to really establish and better embed this area together, integrate this area together. I also wanted to mention very quickly the Cogswell-Macy Act. So this is up for a vote in Congress right now, and the Cogswell-Macy Act kind of tags funding for specialized and differentiation of instruction as guided by what we call the expanded core curriculum. So this is another area where, as we're building out the core curriculum, there's already an established set of guidelines for the expanded core curriculum, which highlight areas that require direct instruction in areas of learning and development that otherwise students kind of learn incidentally. So an example of this would be even learning how to read. A lot of students get that incidental access to print. They see it everywhere. They develop this. They develop their base knowledge. Well, students who are learning really need that direct instruction to get that initial access in general. So this is just another area where we need more funding to promote more rigorous research and how to interline accessibility with UDL. Okay, assumption number 4 is that students read better and learn more when they experience adequate challenge in the texts they encounter. My accessibility lens on this is that in order for students to read better, learn more, and experience those challenges, they require independent access to information. So this really emphasizes the need for materials to be born accessible. Because when materials in the classroom are not accessible, there's always this process of remediation that needs to happen in order to get the material into an accessible format for students. So right there, we are limiting students' self-sufficiency in being able to access and develop their own knowledge and comprehension of materials. I wanted to also highlight the Marrakesh Treaty. This is an international treaty that's been signed by various countries, and it describes provisions in copyright laws to provide access to copyrighted texts in alternative formats such as EPUB, which is accessible digital text, Braille, or large print. So that really highlights basically ensuring equitable access to all the various learning content. Assumption number 5, last but not least, is that comprehension involves building models of what a text says, what it means, and how it can be used. Now, accessibility-wise, how many of you guys have worked with students in special education? Okay, like maybe between 5 and 10 about. Okay, so one thing, for anybody who's worked with a special ed student before, is that there are inevitably gaps in a student's experiential knowledge due to either their sensory diversity, their neurodiversity, or even just access to experiences, okay? A lot of our students in special ed just literally don't get taken out as much as any other students, or students in low SES areas, or just depending on what culture, the family. This extends beyond just kids with, quote-unquote disabilities. So when these students don't have that experiential knowledge to refer to, that impacts their comprehension significantly. I have a photo here of a sunflower with a bowl of sunflower seeds and sunflower oil next to it, because I was actually just assessing a totally blind student last week at the California School for the Blind, and we asked her to do a reading comprehension passage all about sunflowers. And so, the first thing we asked the student was, hey, what do you know about sunflowers? Right? You got to check from her background knowledge first. And she said, oh yeah, they come in lots of different flavors and we snack on them, all the time. But she had never felt a sunflower before. So to her, a sunflower was snacking on sunflower seeds and all the different flavors it comes in. She had no concept of what a sunflower actually was. So that sunflowery-ness she was missing. So, how does that impact assessment of reading comprehension when students don't have that experiential knowledge to refer to. Okay, so kind of rounding the final stretch of the presentation, the idea here, sort of my personal agenda, is to look at all the work that's been done in universal design for learning. So this is sort of the left circle of this Venn diagram. And do a more thorough and rigorous review of the research in the accessibility mindset, what accessibility means, and look at where that can intersect. Because I believe that the intersection of universal design for learning and accessibility practices, that's where we can identify, create, and do research based on equitable opportunities for achievement in the Common Core standards. Right now, our students with diverse learning needs don't even have equitable opportunities to achieve according to these standards. And until they do, there's no way we can thoroughly assess every student in a classroom. I really like that, David, you put your chart up about the high and low strength of the research in each of the assumption areas. I would love to do the same thing, looking at it from the accessibility lens, because that is one of the weaknesses of research in special education, is we simply don't have those large numbers to make it very rigorous. It's a lot of replication studies needed, and really developing expertise in how to differentiate high quality research for low ends. For any of you guys who are interested in more information, I wanted to share with you my contact information. I can provide references for everything that was presented today. Yeah, my name is Ting Su. I am a graduate of the Joint Doctoral Program of Special Ed here. So happy to see some current Joint Doc students in the audience. My email is ysiu@sfsu.edu, and you can find me on Twitter and Facebook, and I tweet from @tvi_ting. Thank you.
University of California at Berkeley, Research Day 2018. Title, Accessibility and the Common Core. Presented by Yue-Ting Su, TVI Comms, PhD, Program in Visual Impairments, San Francisco State University. Twitter @TVI_Ting.